Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you are all here, and I think we all are familiar with each other. It looks to me. I'm Kate Alexander, and I want to welcome you to this discussion class. We have material before us. We have material in you and from you, and so I hope we learn from each other and have fun doing it. There's a lot in this book, as you can see. Have you all read to page 66? You can say, yeah, okay. A lot of you did, so good. If you haven't, I hope you will. We're going to go over some highlights today. Mostly, I'm hoping not to spend time summarizing because I'd like to spend more time in discussion. So please do. And as you read, please note your comments and questions that you have. I think a lot of you here know a lot about early Christianity. And I want to learn from you. But I also want to remember for those of us who perhaps know less than others and might be shy about asking questions that don't appear smart or something. And that is that someone I've learned a lot from is Bart Ehrman. You all know Bart at UNC, a New Testament scholar. And what I really like about Bart is that he usually says in his presentations, "What I don't know is stunning." And I think that if Bart doesn't know a whole lot, and he knows that he doesn't know a whole lot, that we all should, get some comfort from that and realize that there is just so much information to be had. I don't know about you, but I went down a lot of rabbit holes when I went back through here and started having questions. I'd look up something else and you can go in different directions. There are people who have, who disagree with some of the work of this group. And there are a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of it depends on what information that you pay attention to. The authors even acknowledge that they know that they could not get it all right. And that's because some things are unknowable. We just don't have every bit of information that we need to be certain about some things, from the life of Christ and the period in which he lived before and immediately after as well. Some is missing. So, but I want to start out with some of the foundations of this book, because I think it's always important to know who you're listening to, who you're giving your attention to. Are they worthy of your attention? And then we'll have time, I hope, for what was important to you in what you read. So the goals, the stated goals for the book were that they were attempting to reconstruct the lived experiences of diverse peoples across the ancient Mediterranean. So they went back to source material, and they had new material recovered as recently as 2017. But they looked at not only Christian texts, but they also looked at Hebrew texts, and in particular, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that talked a lot about the times and what it was like to live in those times. So they're drawing on a lot of diverse information, and some of it that, of course, as you know, wasn't available until the mid last century. But as I said, more and more keeps coming available. They also said that their attempt was to read history forward, not backwards. And I'm wondering if that struck anybody as an interesting way to look at this, and why? What came up for you? Okay, well, I like the quote that they used in there from Umberto Eco, who said, past, Angie's saying, will I turn my speaker on? You can't hear me? Meredith says yes, Angie. Can you? Okay, all right. I'm sorry.
I think Martha hears you.
Yeah, Martha hears me. All right. Let me just go ahead. I'm sorry to say. Umberto Eco said, past reading has told us what we are supposed to discover. And I think in the context of what we're reading here, what they're saying is, much like the title of Bart Ehrman's book, The Triumph of Christianity, they're starting with an outcome and looking back for what led to that outcome, as opposed to what happened at that period of time that could have led to a lot of different outcomes and didn't. So when you're looking for something in particular, you tend to find it. So they're starting in a different place. They said, we fall victim to the fallacy of the inevitable. Because it happened, it had to happen. We use future events to understand the past. This fallacy scares us back into what we already know or think we know. So who are we listening to here?
I was just going to say that the observation that they're trying to not deduce from current thinking what must have happened in the past doesn't seem all that startling to me. My sense is that it's a staple of historical research that you try to ground yourself in what you know of the period, and then imagine, you know, how the 100 Years' War could have gone differently. It didn't startle me that that was their starting point.
Thank you. Thank you. And so what you're saying is that is a staple of historical scholarship. Good scholars will do that. I think pretty much that they're saying most of us who are not scholarly might tend to read history differently, but okay.
Do you think that that's true? Do you think most of us read history backwards?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not going to say that most of us do. I think that they are positing that it happens. But at any rate, John, would you restate what you said that we didn't hear?
Yeah, sure. You had started out with trying to read history forward, and I think that's an interesting challenge. I also think it's impossible, but should be attempted. And let me make myself clear. We're going to take our current set of values and culture with us. So regardless of how we attempt to do it, it's going to carry it. For example, I'm struggling with two books. One of is Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. The other one is Misreading Scripture Through Individualistic Eyes. So I think the thing to do is to look at it a variety of perspectives, admitting that here is how I see it, and then look for the common among the sites. I take the image of looking through the dark glass at God, you know, so you don't see him clearly, but you see an image. So sharing that image that we see, I think, is what's the key. Given all that statement, I think the time period between that this book is dealing with does have some things that we consider obvious. Sure, how else could it have spread? Sure, it would have expressed itself through its culture. Sure, the Roman Empire was like the Babylonians. After all, they wiped out the 10 tribes of Israel. Those things I think are comforting in the sense of it seems to fit the way we understand things. The power of looking at it that way is then you're, I think, a little more free to have those weird thoughts that go through your mind once in a while, and a little more understanding of other people's weird thoughts that go through their mind.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Maria.
Well, I think it may, but that's obviously incredibly important, the cultural viewpoint and biases that we bring to anything. But I think reading history forward is even more of a challenge than that. I think it means that we don't assume, well, what it says, that what happened had to happen. It's, for example, if we are looking at our history right now, that will be looked in so many years, we know that decisions made by single people will affect the outcome of our elections. And why they made them may be as simple as they got a bribe, or their brother-in-law was married to a candidate, or whatever. So if we can go back in time and learn those facts, we don't take it as, Christianity had to spread because it was, and look at all these huge philosophical issues, but we look at the individual people and the decisions that they made and why they made at that moment without knowing anything about the future, and knowing that any future is possible. Any future is possible at that time. The future hasn't happened. So they're making decisions only on the basis of what they know and have in that moment. Why did they make those decisions? Why did Paul say something or do something? Why did Peter do something? How did it happen? And maybe even the amazement and surprise of knowing that there were 4, other people that thought it would go differently and tried, or whatever. So I tell you, there are parts I'm not looking forward to, like the violence of the Roman Empire. When we were in seminary and when Mike was doing his doctorate, and we were reading about the practices with children, with marriages, with slaves, with everything, it just turned my stomach. And I say, can I just not know about this, please? So knowing that changes your perception of the history and why it happened.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Charles, let's see if we can get some audio for you.
This whole issue of backwards and forwards and how we know if we try to write it forward probably is based upon a truth that I've been slow to recognize, and that is he who writes history makes history. So if it's written down by somebody in the Roman Empire, certainly had the ability to get it all written down. And there were probably some people hiding out in caves in Israel that wrote some things down. But by and large, I suspect a lot of what happened didn't get written down. That is, so we're relying upon conjecture in many cases. I don't know, but I hope a lot more was written down, and I'm gathering it is by reading Bart's work in this way as well. That so there's more history out there that we haven't paid attention to.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Now I want to see if Michael, do you want to say anything briefly about the Christianity seminar?
Yes, the Christianity
Why don't you take
seminar.
it,
Oh,
if you
sorry.
don't mind.
The Christianity seminar, which produced this book, right, was a follow-up to something called the Jesus Seminar, which published a book that some of you may have seen called The Five Gospels. They did a lot more than that, but that was their biggest selling production, which looked at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Gospel of Thomas, right? And so they were they did a radical thing of looking at one of the non-canonical Gospels along with the ones in our Bible, and they went through all the 4 Gospels, the 4 Gospels plus Thomas, and debated each and every saying of Jesus, everything Jesus said, right? That is reported. And they had scholars present papers and they argued over them. But one of their founding principles was that before they moved on, they were going to take a vote to establish what the consensus of the scholars was. This was radical. No one had done that before, right? Because biblical scholars tended to write papers, present them at conferences, and publish books and things, but nobody took a vote to establish what the consensus of scholarship was. And so that was a radical introduction of the Jesus Seminar. And they did that first with the sayings of Jesus. Then they published another series of things on the deeds of Jesus, things that Jesus had done, right? And so once they finished those two, then they moved on to now the Christian seminar, where they're doing the same thing with early Christianity. They're looking at the different documents. People are presenting papers on different aspects of early Christianity, and then they're taking a vote to say, where do we stand as a group on this?
Right.
And so it was, in that sense, a radical new way of doing scholarship, where they, at the end of the meeting, everybody knows what the consensus is.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
But it's the consensus of that group.
That's right.
It's not a random sample.
No, it's not a random sample.
Very good.
It's a consensus of that particular group.
Yeah.
It's a fairly large group, and they do not represent a majority of biblical scholarship, but they represent an important voice.
Yeah.
Right?
They represent historians. Okay, that's very important. I think you all probably know that the literalists do not endorse this work. Okay, so you will be able to find a lot of pushback on this. So yeah. So just a couple of other things about them. They started their work in 2013. Hi, Berla and Chet.
Hey.
Good to see you. And reviewed research from the past 30 to 40 years. And I think Michael has covered what they've done very well. And this is the first major book to come out of the Christianity Seminar.
Excuse me, Mike was talking about the Jesus Seminar, which
Yes.
started in the 80s or earlier, because Mike went to some in the 90s. So the Christianity Seminar is a follow-up sort of
Yes.
that.
Exactly. It is a follow-up. Okay, so one of the interesting things I thought about this book and their approach is that they gave you their conclusions up front. Does anybody remember what would you say their conclusions were, or a major conclusion? Anybody?
Just ordered the book. I read it.
Anybody?
Should I turn your television off after that's all? Or will it go to the Sunday service?
Okay.
Hey, I was thinking about your question of what are the core conclusions,
Mhm.
and it seemed like they said there's a core narrative, and they gave some characteristics of the core narrative, and there were 5 elements that they said, diversified or even contradicted the core narrative. So that's their process. The content of the 5 different conclusions I don't have right at my fingertips, but that seemed important.
Yeah, there are several areas of conclusions, sort of broad statements of their scholarship on different areas. But I think their overall was, in the first 2 centuries, what we think of as Christianity didn't exist. And I think that would not be surprising to most of you either. Is that correct? And most of us knew that there were various movements. But they take it farther. The book is taking it farther, going deeper with that. And they're saying that the first 2 centuries are not an interim or origin period that allowed Christianity to get its act together. It simply was not. It wasn't even thought of. Okay, so I think that's an interesting thing. And they said that they rejected and called pretentious the master narrative's assumption that Christianity acted as a unified, continuous early tradition in an unbroken line. So I'm going to share my screen with you to look at that master narrative. I think that's really at the center here, particularly in terms of not just the facts, but whether they matter today, whether they matter to you. And I'd like you to look at it in terms of, first of all, is this the master narrative, what you would call the master narrative for the Christianity of our age? Is it yours, or has it been yours? Or has it changed over time? So let me do this. Sorry, I'm gonna have to, oops, here we go.
You're talking about what's listed on page 2.
I don't have that right in front of me. What are you saying?
Well,
You're gonna put it up on the screen, right?
I'm going to put the master narrative on the screen. Yeah. Here it is. Okay, you got it? Okay. All right. Jesus came down from heaven to establish the Christian church. He was a fantastic person whose birth marks the very beginning of civilizations. He taught truth and did God-sized things rather. He handed on his complete teachings to his most loyal followers, the apostles. The apostles then relayed correctly to the bishops of the early churches all of the great things Jesus said and did. These first bishops correctly passed down Jesus's teachings and magnificent deeds to the next 2+ centuries of bishops. The faithful line of bishops summarized perfectly Jesus's teachings and acts in the 4th century Nicene Creed, which carried the full truth and authority to the 21st century. Now, let me say that I know that Baptists don't have bishops. We all know that. But let's just say the powers that be. Let's just read that as the powers that be. It is interesting that they use that term because there are a couple of Protestant denominations that have bishops, of course, but I think many of these scholars are not. They're not Catholic, let's just say, and they're not those denominations necessarily. So let me ask you.
Can I add something about that?
Please.
One thing that is true of the Jesus Seminar is that it was incredibly diverse in that sense. You had everybody from Baptists to Catholics to Episcopalians, Lutherans, just in terms of varieties of Christianity in the United States. It was they were well represented.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm. Okay, so what do you think of that? Would you agree that that is the master narrative that's been passed down through the centuries until today? Martha's saying no. And is it or was it ever yours?
Well, I would think from most of our standpoints, this is kind of a straw man. I mean, it's almost a caricature. On the other hand, in younger days, not necessarily personally believing that, but that was a dominant narrative, different terms without the bishops and so forth. But I think a number of writers, and of course, including Ehrman, have pretty well shot this down historically.
Okay, I'm having trouble with my screen share here.
Well, I certainly think it's what they hoped we would do. You know,
I can't find my cursor. Where is it?
I'm going to close my laptop. Yeah, I don't need to be in the program.
We can see your screen. Oh,
Your screen is up here.
Yeah, I know, but I wanted to stop screen share.
Oh, I see. Okay. Let's see.
I know, I can't find my cursor. I can't get my cursor. Where is it?
There's a screen. So just keep scrolling to the right. There you go. Now, okay.
Now I'm gonna have to go.
Named Ehrman's book, Lost Christianity. It's about all the different versions of Christianity.
Speak up, you all, okay? Continue.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned from Bart Ehrman. I think the book was Lost Christianity. It's about all the different quote unquote Christian groups and viewpoints about which you find fragments of writing. So as a historian, you can say there were all these different Christianities, most of which got lost in the course of time and became this master narrative. I blame a lot of it on Paul, but that's kind of my bias. But we do know that you had the Pauline group, and then you had James and Peter back in Rome, and they were in some conflict, and the Pauline view prevailed. And so various narratives that may never have survived in the way that the master narrative did got lost. And Bart Ehrman's other book about, you mentioned earlier, the Triumph of Christianity, is all about how Paul turned a ragtag group of stragglers into a large number of people.
Mhm. And we are thus far focusing mostly not on the Pauline peoples. You notice that in the book, which I think is, interesting because again, and Ehrman does that. He focuses a lot on the Pauline groups, and that I think is reading history backwards, actually. So I mean, we'll see that as we go through these 2 centuries. John, yeah, do you have something?
Yeah, there is a commonest pattern that we're looking at here, where a reformer, Christ, comes to straighten out people so they understand correctly. After his death, there is an activity of his followers, which ends up starting a new path rather than reforming the old path. You could say Martin Luther did that. Reformation, he did not intend to start a new denomination. He intended to solve the problems of the old denomination. So that seems to be a very common way in which new things are introduced to an existing structure from the outside in by a reformer, see what happens after the death, see if it's in there. The other thing, a fundamentalist could claim what we're looking at was guided by God. That is exactly the path it was supposed to take.
Yeah. So, and so that's theology, and so is the master narrative. So it's, what they're taking from it. Yeah. Martha, did you want to say something? I can't tell. Okay. All right. I just think it's important to think about what the master narrative, the importance of it. And over time. Now, the authors say it became orthodoxy, proper belief and practice. And heavily influenced European and American societies, projecting their own power and belief systems back onto the earliest centuries.
I think that's a key point. It served the interests of those in power.
Yeah.
And who were men, and who were educated and who took upon themselves the power, as the master narrative would say, to be the bearers of truth, and there was no other truth.
Right.
I think there was something I felt was missing in that master narrative that I think was actually prior to establishing of the Christian church, and that is that God sent Jesus to the earth to die for our sins. That was not part of the specific statements in the master narrative, but that was certainly the one I got as a child. Somehow this man came and died for my sins, which is the part I was rebelling against. So And certainly that was what we were taught as children. We bought it all the way until
Right.
we started questioning.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a good point in rejecting this. There is also what they say is the direct line. There is theology in here, not history. There's a lot of theology in here, not history. And we see, as they said, we do not see this at all outside of perhaps he was a fantastic person and he taught the truth and did God-sized things, which they were trying to, yeah. Outside of those, it was simply, there's not evidence for that in these first 2 centuries, not evidence of this theology. So let's see. They said there were, in the first 2 centuries, different kinds of new covenants, sometimes tangentially and sometimes centrally related to different Jesuses. Let's see. Okay. All right. Let's stop there and go to the names. What were the people like there? What did you get from this? Who were these people that we're talking about as those in the first 2 centuries who were tangentially or centrally directed to Jesus's teachings? Who were these people? Any thoughts? They were Jews, right? You know that they were Jews, and they were by and large still practicing their faith.
I got the sense that they were at least to some degree marginalized. Meaning they were not the elite, the powerful, or the rich.
Right, they were not. They were primarily peasants, day workers, enslaved, and craftspeople. There were a few wealthy in some communities that we've read about, particularly in Paul. Their numbers were unknown, but they were a real minority in the Roman Empire. Right, they're estimated, they vary widely, but between 2 and 7 million Jews across the Roman Empire, about 3, some say up to 10% of the population. Okay, and I'm going to share the screen again to also make the point that they didn't look like this.
Yes, they did. They're not church.
Okay, you've all seen this. This is Warner Solomon's 1940 depiction of Jesus. They may well have looked more like this. This is a 6th century BCE depiction of slaves coming out of Egypt. And this is the result of the most recent research of what people think Jesus looked like. Okay, and not all, as you can imagine, we don't have a picture of Jesus, right? And so not everyone agrees. A lot of people still cling to, and he still pretty much has a Mediterranean olive kind of skin color there. But James Charlesworth, who's the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls Project out of Princeton, believes that Jesus was very dark-skinned. For one thing, if only, he would have been very tanned. No sunscreen, right? Yeah. So I think this is important because this is the guy who looks most like the Romans, right? or many Romans, or what we,
Definitely has those, right?
he's definitely got the nose. Yeah, the Roman nose. It's very likely that in addition to their practices and dress as poor people, there were physical things that people might have noticed as well. I invite you as you go through this book to think about that. You know, you don't have to buy it. As we all know, we don't have a picture. But what I find interesting is, why don't we? You know, to ask the question, why is it so difficult to think and to picture historically and theologically that he also did not look like us? Okay, so moving
I
on.
think in some ways, that first picture you showed became part of the master narrative. I mean, the master narrative, you know, picked up things like the blood atonement, picked up things like anti-gay marriage in more recent times. The master narrative does have these accretions, and one of them along the way was that picture of Jesus.
Yeah,
Yes, sure.
We all saw it in Sunday school.
That's right.
yeah, which is very interesting.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, well, but again, this is 1940, and a Western European depiction of Jesus started long before that, as you know, from earlier depictions. One of the interesting things is that Paul writes against men wearing long hair, and yet that didn't seem to bother the Western European image of him, which is very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, okay. What's that?
Paul called it shameful.
Yeah, he called it shameful.
Yeah, for men.
Okay, so before we run out of time here, I want to go here as well. And there were many names of groups identified in texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries, and these are some of the names of these groups. Do you have any reactions to these?
Does anybody know where the Coptics get it on the game? What we know of as a Coptic Christian, was it during this time or was that much
Yeah,
later?
well, we do have very good evidence of their existence very early. The Nag text came from that area, right? And so I would have put them in this list.
You
I
would.
would have, yeah. There's another one that to me was just totally glaringly absent, and I'm just like scratching my head and why are they not talking about this? That was probably the largest of all of these groups, okay? And I challenge you to go, even the Wikipedia article does a fairly good job. You look up Marcion, M-A-R-C-I-O-N, in the early church, right? In 144, the church at Rome kicked him out, right? And arguably up to 1/3 of the Christian churches around the Mediterranean stuck their hand up and said, "We're with Marcion."
Was he a Gnostic?
He's often described as a Gnostic. He had certainly some of his teachings were influenced by Gnosticism, but he was mainly a dualist. He preached that there were two gods. There was the spiritual God, that was the God of Jesus, and the physical God, which was the creator, right? And that the spirit is good, the body is evil, and therefore the Jews are evil because they worship the creator God. It was an extremely anti-Jewish version of the early Jesus movement. And so it's a little inexplicable why they don't mention it.
Okay,
Right?
all right, thank you. They do though, later on. They do later in the book.
Yeah.
They did not, they don't have that name here.
This one.
Yeah, that name here, but they do get to that.
Yeah.
And I think you'll all really find that interesting.
Yeah.
Any implications of these names that stick out to you? Yes, Margaret.
Yeah, so hi, sorry I was late, by the way. I do think that one of the really interesting aspects of these names and of the entire, set of narratives so far that we've been discussing is this idea of the collective rather than the individual. That even when you're looking at our own biases as we interpret the methodology of time in the study of time, it's very individual, and we tend to say we, and we tend to say my instead of we, and the I instead of the the whole idea of the collective seemed so much more important to what they are presenting than anything that we are accustomed to dealing with in today's understanding of religion. Now, I realize that Binkley is very different in their manifestation of their belief, but when you look at sort of the cultural idea of religion, I feel like we collectively tend to say my and me and our, and rather than our and we as a people. So the idea of all of these names being collective rather than individual is really different. When I, at least when I was reading it, it seemed to be a very different take on the following of Christ, because everything was collective. So I would say all of these names seem to be very collective rather than individualistic. That was my interpretation.
Yeah, good point. So relational, community. Yeah, very good.
I don't understand the problem. I totally get followers of the Anointed One, because in Greek, and Mike was saying that the same thing, that the distinction they make is important, because we don't think about it, what it meant, what the person was saying when he said what we transliterate in our Bible as these Christians meant the follower of the Anointed One, which we could have translated instead of transliterating and using that phrase. But it is a phrase. It is what they're saying. It is the words they're using. They're using the word Christus, the Anointed One, and they're saying followers of Christ. So
They're not yet using Christus at this time. So we'll get to that later.
But they quote the people, the writing letters, the Romans writing letters about what they've done to the followers of Christ.
Yeah, that was about 116, the first reference, Pliny to Trajan. That was the first surfacing of that. So I think these are, and it was interesting that the Romans introduced the term, right? But it's
not even 100 years after the death of Christ.
True.
So that's what I'm saying. We're talking about the first 2 centuries. That's within the first 2 centuries. Yeah. It would be like, we're now in 1920. It would be as if, Christ had died in 1833, and we're writing about, this is about our great grandparents' time.
Yeah. I think it's important here, and I should have put this, these are the earliest groups. These are what they call themselves. And the point the authors are making is they don't call themselves Christians. They're also, let me see, I can't do it there. Want to point out that this whole name of Anointed One, which you bring up, it means it's a politically charged meaning, and anointed ones in Hebrew can also be Messiah, and they also anointed with oil prophets, many other people, and in king, they're kings. That is not true of the Romans. Okay, they did not anoint their kings, and they already had a king. So to identify Jesus as the anointed one, these authors are saying, as I read it, that was a political problem, a major political problem. The other ones, probably not too threatening in and of themselves as they name themselves. Although enslaved of God sounds pretty provocative, because I think you found in your reading that there were many slaves in the Roman Empire. People were enslaved when they were conquered. It was a very common way to get things done. I think we'll go ahead.
I want to make sure I understand something about all. So during this period of time, the assumption would be all of these people were primarily Jewish. And they were, so this was a particular person in Judaism that they were attracted to. So now, of course, they were, I guess, in what we call Israel, or whatever that territory, in Asia Minor, and in Greece, I guess, during this time. So how they all viewed themselves as both, you know, Jewish and followers, I guess, of some, I guess these developed in different regions of this Mediterranean, basically.
If you want to think about time frames, we know Paul died in the early 60s, right? So all his letters have to be earlier than that. Okay? And so so we know that by the early 60s, you had churches that were a high percentage of people were Jewish, but some were not. And that mixture varied across the Mediterranean, because it was probably the church of Galatia probably had a lot higher percentage of non-Jews, right, than some of the other churches, right? But the church of Corinth may have been 85% Jews in that church. So you can see that mixing starting to happen even that early. And
Yeah.
that's, of course, a lot of what Paul's trying to get his head around, right? He's saying, how can you be Jewish and a follower of Jesus and carry out the implications, right, of Jesus' teaching? And so it was beginning to be a tension already at that time.
And they were fighting over circumcision, which they wouldn't have if they were all Jewish.
Yeah, and it would all blow up, of course, around the year 70 and become an increasing problem all the way up to the second Jewish revolt, in which you would get a real separation between Judaism.
Yeah. Well, we know accepting the Gentiles was a major issue in the early centuries. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We will, I think, if we can next time go into the Living with Empire. We read the first chapter of that, Engine of Empire Violence, this time, but I think we can put it all together next time. It's pretty grim. I think if you did get that far. And I know I really was surprised by the presence of slavery to the extent that it was used in the Roman Empire. I'd known about the crucifixions, but in 70,000, or rather 70 in the current era, almost 100,000 Judeans were sent to Rome as slaves to build the Colosseum. The empire was built on, driven by, grew by enslaving more and more people. And Roman citizenship was tightly connected to the ownership of the enslaved. Ring any bells? Yeah. Yes, John.
I think that Margaret's statement deserves far more thinking in between sessions. You're not talking about a bunch of individuals who have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Those are terms that make absolutely no sense in the culture that you're dealing with. You're dealing with a culture who expresses itself, the words we use are tribes, commonness, shared, family extensions. And the temptation to say, to use words that reflect this thing that happened after Martin Luther, this personal relationship with Christ, is, I think, detrimental to struggling with what's going on here. And I would extend it to this extent. Remember, we're just talking about what's happening within the Roman Empire. There's a lot happening outside of the Roman Empire. We're going to study this, don't get me wrong. And I'm not extending the study. But my challenge to everybody personally would be, think about what it is not to be an individual. Try to even consider that individual as defined in our modern culture. Try to consider the commons. The commons, I'll give you an example. I'm going to shut up on this one. A lot of people say the last place I'd share a problem is at church. That's not a commons statement. That's the first place you go, to your family.
Mm-hmm.
But don't blame Martin Luther. I grew up Catholic, and we had all those paintings of the soul going to hell and burning, in the flames, and the nuns drilled it into us that we were individually accountable for our salvation, and if we didn't personally repent and say that and go to mass and all that, our family couldn't do anything to get us out. If we were lucky enough to end in purgatory, they might be able to pray us out, but individuality was very much emphasized as, individual accountability. And that has been really hard for me as a chaplain. When I have families that are very conservative and they are so worried about their loved one going to hell, and I tell them about, the friends that lowered the paralytic down and Jesus forgave him healed him on the strength of their friend's faith, not his faith, and how, the prodigal and different things, and they just can't comprehend this God that would forgive an individual because they're in a loving community. It's just, I don't use it a lot, but sometimes it brings relief. But you're right. We only believe that you can be saved, in quotation, individually on your own merits.
Yeah. Yeah.
May I interject something just briefly? If you think about the idea of the collective and what does the collective mean politically, this idea of how we identify with others becomes really central to what you're speaking to, this idea of why are the Romans categorizing and the power of the collective in that we and them narrative. The we and them narrative right now is becoming very prevalent in society, this idea of how does a political force gather, how do they self-identify, and then how does that play out within a society? And it becomes both a result, a catalyst, and a reflection of what has happened in the collective. This idea that political movements have power, even in the early church, this idea that this group of people became powerful within the collective, I think was really disturbing to the Roman Empire, because they became a them that they are then having to deal with. And the idea of political machinations then becomes part of the narrative. How the government talks about a group and how the group talks about themselves. And I think we do have a hard time with that until we start thinking we do that even now. And the idea of the individual and the collective is something that we still struggle with, but I do think it was really different to what John was saying. I think it was a really different time, in our understanding of that is always going to be faulty. We can
not
try.
collective. It's a collective of collectives. When we talk about it nowadays, we talk about individual join a collective. My model that I'm building says, no, it's a member of this collective now becoming a member of that collective. That's hard for me to struggle with.
And they would say, baptize me, but they didn't mean me. They meant my wife, my children, my servants, everybody. I've made a decision. And in some Latino churches, that's how baptisms happen. The dad walks forward, or the mom, the matriarch walks forward. Everybody's going to join this church.
In the book of Acts, you actually have a narrative of exactly that happening.
Mhm.
That a person, when it's connected with the story of Paul in prison, and the earthquake happens and the doors come open, but the slaves don't leave. Well, the jailer then, it says he was baptized with all of his family.
Yep.
Okay?
Yeah.
And
I really appreciate your comments, everyone, and this idea of the collectives and small collectives at this time is very important, because we are talking very, very early. And we're not talking Acts yet. We're not, and it is a challenge to stay with where we are, to see what really happened in those early days and how they're different, and how things transformed over time. And we're gonna get to all of that. It's a pretty rich book. So for the next time, I think it's, and Michael warned me to mention, I need to give you the chapter numbers, because I am reading mine on my Kindle, and I want to read down to experimental families, which you might want to read given this conversation, and please do if you want to, but I'm trying to do it in about 60 pages each, and that will get us through belonging to Israel. So
which should be the last chapter we read?
the last chapter you read should be belonging to Israel. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good to be with you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.